On a warm July evening in 1346, Simon Poulet, a wealthy merchant from Campigny, sat down to dinner with his family. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the clinking of silverware. As they ate, Simon, a man known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue, made a casual remark that would soon seal his fate. It might be better if Edward were to become King of France, he mused aloud. At least he would rule well, unlike Philip, who does a poor job. Little did Simon know that those words would travel far beyond the walls of his home. They were whispered from ear to ear, passed through the town like a dark rumor. Eventually, the whispers reached the ears of King Philip of France, a man known for his hot temper and ruthless rule. Philip's reaction was swift and brutal. Simon was arrested, dragged through the streets, and brought to the Paris meat market. The crowd gathered, whispering and pointing, as Simon was hanged from a meat hook, just like a piece of beef. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps as Philip's men began to butcher him alive. First his arms were severed, then his legs, and finally his head. His limbless, headless torso was hung by a chain from the common gallows at Montfaucon, just outside Paris, as a grim warning to anyone who dared speak against the king. Meanwhile, far across the sea, King Edward of England was setting sail with a vast fleet of ships. The English navy, with its magnificent streamers flying, was heading south, away from the English coast. The destination was a closely guarded secret, known only to Edward and his closest advisors. The fleet was equipped with enough rations to reach Gascony, but the winds of fate had other plans. On July 11th, 2 weeks after setting out, the English ships turned their prows and started sailing south. They were heading towards the Normandy beaches. The trumpets from Edward's flagship blared out, and the great ships of the English navy unfurled their sails, ready to meet their destiny. As the ships approached the coast, the men on board were a mix of excitement and tension. They knew that this was the beginning of a great adventure, one that could change the course of history. Little did they know that the king they followed was about to become Edward the Conqueror, and that the land they were about to invade would soon be drenched in blood and glory. The air was thick with tension as the English forces, led by Sir Thomas Dagworth, realized they were trapped by the vast French Breton army. It was early morning on June 9th, and the English were severely outnumbered, facing an enemy at least 20 to 40 times their size. The French, led by Charles de Blois, were confident of an easy victory. One French knight even boasted he would tie up Dagworth like a parcel and present him to de Blois. But the English, despite the odds, were determined to fight to the death. Dagworth and his men, though heavily outnumbered, dug in and prepared for battle. They had little hope of winning, but they refused to surrender. The fighting began at dawn and raged on for hours. Wave after wave of French soldiers attacked, but the English held their ground. By the end of the day, after what seemed like an eternity of relentless combat, the French finally retreated. Dagworth and his men, though wounded and exhausted, had accomplished something close to a miracle. They had fought off an army that vastly outnumbered them, and they had survived. Dagworth wrote to the king, boasting that he had led the bravest men England had to offer. This battle, while a small skirmish in the grand scheme of things, revealed the resilience and determination of the English forces. It also highlighted the growing tensions and paranoia of King Philip of France. For years, Philip had engaged in a war of words and diplomatic squabbles with King Edward III of England. He had achieved little, and his people were starting to mock him. Philip's response to dissent was to crack down with anger and tyranny, which only worsened his problems. Edward, on the other hand, had never resorted to such brutality. His determination to keep the war on French soil earned him the goodwill of his people, and his military strategies had proven effective. However, Edward knew that the upcoming campaign would be his most challenging yet. He had never defeated Philip on French soil, and the French army was renowned for its size and skill. The French had also begun to adapt to Edward's tactics, as seen in the battle where de Blois advanced on foot, avoiding the traps that had previously worked against the French. Edward needed a decisive victory to secure his position and meet the expectations of his parliament and people. To prepare for this campaign, Edward spared no effort. He chose Normandy as the landing site, partly for its strategic advantages but also for its symbolic value. Normandy, after all, had once been ruled by the Duke who conquered England. Edward's landing was seen as a way to reclaim his ancestral lands, a powerful message to his troops and the French alike. When he arrived at St. Vaast-le-Hague, he knighted his son, the Black Prince, and other promising young men, symbolizing the beginning of a new era. The landing was met with little resistance, and the English quickly secured the nearby ports of Barfleur and Cherbourg, looting and burning them in the process. Edward's army, divided into 3 divisions, began its march towards Paris. The vanguard, led by the young Prince Edward, moved ahead, followed by the main body under Edward's direct command, and the rear guard led by Bishop Thomas Hatfield. As they moved through Normandy, the English left a trail of destruction. Towns like Valognes and Carnton submitted to Edward, but his troops often ignored his orders to spare the lives and property of the inhabitants, looting and burning the towns instead. The inhabitants of St. Lo, fearing what was to come, decided to resist. They broke down bridges and barricaded streets, but their efforts were futile against the overwhelming force of Edward's army. The town was brutally sacked, and the inhabitants suffered greatly, with many killed, raped, and taken as prisoners. The next major target was Keene, a well-fortified town with a large population and a strong garrison. Inside the walls, the Count of Eu, the Lord of Tancarville, and the Bishop of Bay, were ready to defend the town. Outside, Robert Bertrand and his forces waited, but they quickly realized the scale of the invasion and retreated into the town. Edward's army approached Keene in the afternoon, and the king drew up his men in battle formation. The sight of the approaching English forces was daunting, and the defenders of Keene retreated behind the walls, strengthening their defenses. Edward knew he couldn't afford a long siege, so he decided to attack immediately. The 2 great abbeys built by William the Conqueror, the Abbey aux Hommes and the Abbey aux Dames, lay outside the walls, and Edward was determined to spare them. When the Bishop of Bay refused to surrender, Edward's resolve hardened. He ordered his men to storm the town, and the battle for Keene began. The vanguard had raced ahead, and before Bertrand's soldiers could find safety in the old town, the troops led by the Prince and the Earl of Warwick had already attacked. The narrow streets became a chaotic battlefield, where archers faced off against men at arms. The fighting was intense, and Edward, worried about his archers, sent a message to the Earl of Warwick to retreat. But the chaos and the heat of battle were too much, and the Earl found himself drawn into the fighting. Realizing that retreat was impossible, Edward ordered a full attack. The bridge between the new and old towns became the center of the battle. Welsh spearmen, seeing the low tide, waded through the river to attack the defenders from behind. They swarmed the bridge, and the defenders, losing heart, fell back, leaving their comrades to be killed. Some knights took refuge in the upper floors of the gatehouse, watching in horror as their compatriots were slaughtered. They were lucky. One of them recognized Sir Thomas Holland and pleaded for mercy, and Holland took them prisoner, saving their lives. When the dust finally settled, the streets and fields were littered with the bodies of more than 5,000 Frenchmen. Over 100 knights and 120 esquires were taken prisoner, and 300 Genoese archers lay dead, their crossbows useless without bolts. The town had resisted, and in the chaos many women were raped. Some English knights tried to stop the violence, but Edward did nothing to intervene. He was determined to show his enemies that he was a force to be reckoned with, a warrior king who would not be stopped. After the battle, Edward spent 5 days in Keene, preparing for what lay ahead. He sent troops to destroy the surrounding countryside, and when the citizens of Bay heard what had happened, they quickly surrendered to avoid a similar fate. Edward accepted their submission, promising to protect them, and ordered 1,200 more archers to be sent from England to reinforce his army. He also held a council with his nobles, and they decided to head straight for Philip. On July 31st, Edward ordered the army to break camp and march towards Rouen. They left a trail of destruction 14 miles wide as they moved, the marshals on either side of the main force burning and pillaging everything in their path. They camped at Troarn, then Rumisnil, and on August 5th they reached the city of Lycia. 2 days later, they were just 25 miles from Rouen when 2 cardinals sent by the Pope arrived, proposing a peace deal. Philip offered to return the counties of Ponthieu and the Duchy of Aquitaine to Edward, but Edward was not interested. He dismissed the cardinals, determined to fight. Philip, meanwhile, was gathering a massive army. He had crossed the Seine and briefly headed towards Edward, but then news arrived that a second English army had landed in Flanders. Philip rushed back to Rouen, unsure of what to do. He destroyed the bridge over the Seine to cut himself off from Edward and sent troops to guard the next bridges, hoping to delay Edward's advance. Philip's plan was to gather a larger army and then crush the English, but Edward had other ideas. Edward destroyed the manors of the King of France, even those near Paris, but he did not attack the city. He knew the risks were too great. Instead, he focused on crossing the Seine. He and his men raced to find a bridge, but at Pont de l'Arche, Vernon, Mance, and Moulins, they found either the bridges in ruins or heavily defended. They had no choice but to keep moving, and by August 13th they reached Poissy. The bridge at Poissy was broken, but the piles were still in place, and some beams floated in the river. Carpenters were called to work, and soon a single beam was laid across the water. As they finished, a French force appeared on the other side. Northampton and 24 knights rushed across the narrow bridge, swords drawn, and fought off the French, holding them back as more English crossed. By the end of the day, between 500 and 1,200 Frenchmen lay dead, and Edward had his bridge. The next day, Philip learned that Edward held the bridge at Poissy. His plan to trap Edward had failed, and now he had to act. He issued a public challenge, declaring he would meet Edward's army in the area between Poissy and Paris. Edward responded, saying he would be delighted to fight but would choose the time and place. He then ordered his men to burn every town and village between Poissy and Paris, including Montjoy, the king's favorite residence. Philip marched south, thinking Edward would fight on the plains south of Paris. But Edward, a skilled strategist, saw an opportunity. He crossed the Seine at Poissy and marched north, escaping the trap. Philip's advisors were wrong. Edward was not running away. He was looking for a better place to fight, just as he had done before in Scotland and La Flamegree. He sent a formal letter to Philip, stating his intention to end the war by battle, and insisting that he would not let Philip choose the time and place. Edward was determined to face Philip on his own terms, ready to prove himself as the greatest warrior in Christendom. Edward had crossed the Seine on the 16th, and now the Somme River lay ahead, cutting off his path. Philip, the French king, had destroyed all the bridges, leaving Edward with a tough choice. If he stayed on the south bank, the massive French army would soon surround him. It felt like France was a giant spider web, and Edward's army was a fly that could be trapped and slowly devoured. The French could avoid a pitched battle, which would be risky due to Edward's skilled archers. To escape, Edward needed to cross the Somme. There was one place where Edward could cross safely, the ford called Blanchetac. It was a shallow path marked by a white stone, only passable at low tide. Philip knew about this ford, and had sent Godmer du Fay with a strong force to guard it. Edward sent Warwick to try and force a bridge at Pont Remy, but he was driven back with heavy losses. Attempts at other bridges also failed. Food was running low, and Philip's army was closing in. Edward was in a tight spot. But Edward had something Philip didn't, the bravery of his men. When Edward needed volunteers for a dangerous mission, he had plenty of eager knights. He chose the Earl of Northampton and Sir Reginald Cobham to lead the attack on the ford. With 100 men at arms and 100 archers, they waded into the water, 12 men abreast. The archers kept the French pinned down with rapid fire, while the men at arms charged across the river and up the bank. Despite heavy losses, they took the first position, allowing more men to follow. The archers moved closer, and the English numbers grew. The French men at arms realized they were outmatched and fled, leaving their infantry behind. The English pursued and killed many of them. It was a miraculous escape, and the English army crossed the Somme just before the tide came in, cutting Philip off. Edward now had the upper hand. He was in Ponthieu, land he claimed as his own, and he could choose where to fight. He stopped near Crécy, a strategic position with the forest covering one flank. On the morning of August 26, 1346, Edward and his son, the Prince of Wales, rode out to survey the land. Edward positioned his men in 3 battalions on a hill, with the prince leading the first, Northampton the second, and Edward himself in the rear. The archers were placed on the flanks, and the baggage wagons formed a corral for the horses. But Edward had a secret weapon, about 100 small cannons and new gun devices called ribalds. These were loaded on the carts, and had been brought across the ford at Blanchetac. Edward also unfurled a new banner, a dragon in his own arms, a symbol of English power. The troops dug pits in front of their lines to break the charge of the French men-at-arms. 4 French knights appeared, surveying the English formation, but Edward ordered his men to let them go. He wanted the French to see how few they were, and to be tempted to attack. Edward rode among his men, giving them speeches of honor and courage. He promised them glory and protection from God and the Virgin Mary. The men were inspired, and the rain began to fall, dampening the crossbow strings of the Genoese archers who were part of the French army. By mid-afternoon, the Genoese archers advanced, shouting insults at the English. The French army, about 3 times the size of the English, followed behind. The English archers waited patiently, and when the Genoese were in range, Edward's trumpets signaled the attack. The English archers unleashed a hail of arrows, piercing the Genoese and their armor. The Genoese were devastated, and many retreated, but the French commanders, including Philip, ordered them to be killed if they retreated. The Genoese were caught between the English arrows and the French blades, and the battle was about to turn in Edward's favor. The Battle of Crécy was more than just a victory for King Edward III of England. It was a turning point in the history of warfare and European society. On that fateful day, the English, outnumbered and facing one of the most feared military forces in Christendom, not only held their ground but dealt a crushing defeat to the French. The victory was a testament to Edward's leadership, strategic thinking, and the courage of his men, especially the young Prince Edward, who fought bravely and earned his father's praise. The battle began with the French mercenaries fleeing, but the French knights, driven by their sense of honor and duty, rallied and charged up the hill against the English position. Wave after wave, they attacked, only to be cut down by the English archers. The young Prince Edward, despite his age, showed remarkable bravery, fighting fiercely and nearly being overwhelmed before his father sent reinforcements. The sight of the blind King John of Bohemia, leading his knights to certain death, added a tragic element to the already brutal conflict. Despite their valor, the French could not break the English lines, and by nightfall, it was clear that the English had won. King Philip VI of France, though a strong leader, saw his army disintegrate around him. With only a handful of loyal knights, he fled the battlefield, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The next day, more French forces arrived, only to meet the same fate as their predecessors. The English, under the command of the Earl of Northampton, defeated these latecomers, adding to the grim toll of the battle. The casualties were staggering. Over 1,500 French knights and nobles, along with thousands of infantrymen, lay dead. In contrast, the English lost only about 300 men. The victory at Crécy marked the beginning of a new era in warfare. The use of the longbow, a weapon wielded by commoners, had proven that even the most elite and heavily armored knights could be defeated. This shift in military power had far-reaching consequences, challenging the traditional feudal order and the dominance of the nobility. The battle also had profound political implications. Edward III's victory not only bolstered his reputation as a skilled and successful king, but also undermined the authority of the French king and the influence of the papacy. The French pope, who had supported Philip, could not explain why God had favored the English, leading to questions about the divine right of kings and the power of the church. For the English, Crécy was a source of immense pride and confidence. The common archers, who had been the key to victory, were celebrated as heroes. This shift in the perception of the common man's role in society was a precursor to the broader social changes that would follow in the years to come. In the end, the Battle of Crécy was not just a military triumph, but a testament to the power of leadership, innovation, and determination. King Edward III had not only won a battle, but had reshaped the future of warfare and the social order of medieval Europe. His legacy, and that of the brave men who fought with him, would be remembered for centuries to come.